This anime looks gentle. Soft colors, quiet music, slow moments. At first glance, the Apothecary Diaries feels calm, but as season 2 begins, something becomes very clear. Almost every problem starts the same way. Someone knows something they should not know. A book, a medicine, a detail about the body, and little by little, the story teaches us this. In this world, knowledge is not freedom, it is a risk. So today, I want to talk about why knowledge is dangerous in the Apothecary Diaries and why Maomao survives by hiding what she knows. Season 2 shows us more of the palace. More people, more rules, more tension. It is still beautiful, but now we see the pressure more clearly. Rank decides who matters, rules decide who speaks. Most people here do not survive by being smart, they survive by being quiet. And once you understand that, the danger of knowledge starts to make sense. Because the danger does not start with poison, it starts with something smaller, something harmless. Books. In season 2, we see books being brought into the palace, not just any books, explicit ones. Books meant to educate the concubines about intimacy, for example, so the emperor will be satisfied. At first, in season 1, this feels strange, and in season 2 as well. So, why allow books in a place where most people cannot read? The answer is simple. These books are not about freedom, they are about control. Soon after, we see something important happen. More women start reading. And Shaolan is one of the first ones who truly wants to learn. She does not just want to read, she wants to write. She wants skills she can use once she leaves the palace. This moment feels hopeful, but it also reveals the truth. Literacy is only safe when it serves the system. The books are allowed because they shape behavior. They make easier to guide. Shaolan's learning is an accident, not the goal. Knowledge here is not shared to empower, it is shared to manage people quietly. And that leads to a hard question. If knowledge is only allowed when it benefits those in power, is it really a gift? Books shape how people think, but medicine shapes something deeper, the body. And in season 2, we learn how dangerous that knowledge can be. In season 2, we learn something disturbing. Woman lived inside the palace for a year as someone else. Concubine Jin had already died. She was not poisoned, she was beaten to death after a fight with a lookalike named Tao, and Tao took her place. To maintain the disguise, Tao used poisonous mushrooms, not to kill, but to explain changes: hair loss, skin rashes, weakness, symptoms that could pass as illness. Over time, those same poisons killed her. This case matters because it shows something deeper. Poison here is not always sudden. Sometimes it is slow. Sometimes it is medicine used wrong or knowledge used too long. Mao Mao understands this immediately. She knows that understanding the body also means understanding risk. That is why medicine is controlled, not because it heals, but because it can destroy quietly. That is why Mao Mao is warned. Do not make medicine openly. Do not let others know what you can do. Because in this world, knowledge of the body is power, and power is never safe. Hiding knowledge keeps Mao Mao alive, but it also changes her. Because when you hide what you know, you start hiding who you are. In season 2, Mao Mao often seems distant. She jokes, she avoids attention, she stays on the side. Some people call her cold, but the story shows us the truth. She sees too much. She understands danger early. She notices patterns others miss. That is why she survives. But it also isolates her. When she helps someone, she does it quietly. When she understands something, she keeps it to herself. Even with Jinshi, she avoids emotional closeness. And it's not because she does not care, but because being seen has always been dangerous for her. Season 2 makes this very clear. Smart women attract attention. Attention leads to suspicion. Suspicion leads to punishment. So Maomao chooses distance. She hides behind calm reactions. She survives by pretending she does not matter. And that leaves one final question. If knowing too much makes you lonely, is survival worth the cost? By the end of the season 2, a pattern becomes clear. The Apothecary Diaries is not just about mysteries, it is about survival. Knowledge does not change the system, it does not fix injustice, it only shows you where the dangers are. Maomao understands this early. She does not try to challenge the world, she learns how to live inside it. She hides her intelligence, she limits her curiosity, not because she's weak, but because she wants to live. And sometimes that is the only kind of intelligence a world like this allows. Knowing the truth does not always set you free. Sometimes knowledge only teaches you where not to speak. In most stories, uncovering the truth changes everything. A mystery is solved, culprit is exposed, a hidden crime is dragged into the light, and once that happens, the world is supposed to react. People apologize, system collapse, justice in some form arrives. That expectation is so deeply wired into storytelling that we rarely question it. Proof leads to change, knowledge leads to reform, seeing clearly leads to doing better. But the Apothecary Diaries makes a very different promise. It shows us the truth slowly, carefully, methodically, and then it shows us something far more uncomfortable. The world barely moves. Poisons are identified, conspiracies are unraveled, fake deaths are revealed, real deaths are explained, and then the palace clears its throat. Meals are served, ranks remain, daily routines resume. No revolution, no catharsis, no dramatic shift in how power works. And that's not a flaw in the story, that is the story. This video isn't about whether the system in the Apothecary Diaries Season 2 is cruel. This show never pretends it isn't. This video is about something more unsettling. Why, even when the truth is visible, even when the injustice is obvious, most people still choose to survive inside the system rather than challenge it, and why the system quietly depends on that choice. There are ghosts in this story, but what's important is not whether they exist. What matters is how they function. These so-called hauntings in the inner court are not framed as supernatural events, they are framed as patterns. A figure appears at the same time, in the same place, wearing the same clothing, reflected in the same mirror. And when people panic, nothing official happens. No investigation, no announcement, no reassurance. Just silence. That silence is deliberate because fear doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't need evidence. It doesn't even need belief in the supernatural. Fear only needs uncertainty. Historically, this is extremely accurate. In imperial court systems, especially in inner courts where women and servants had no public authority, fear was one of the most efficient tools of control. An accusation could be denied, crime could be argued, but a ghost? A ghost can't be cross-examined. So instead of asking, is this real? People ask a safer question, what if it is? And that question alone is enough to change behavior. People avoid places, they lower their voices, they stop asking questions. The system doesn't need to act. fear enforces itself. This is why the show never rushes to debunk the ghost publicly. Maomao explains how it works, but she never turns that explanation into a formal accusation. Not because she's afraid, but because she understands something crucial. Direct confrontation is dangerous, explanation is survivable. What's unsettling is that fear in the Apothecary Diaries rarely comes from direct violence. It comes from implication, repetition, suggestion, shared rumor. The court does not terrorize people loudly, it lets them terrorize themselves. This mirrors our historical reality. Inner courts were not ruled primarily by laws or punishments, they were ruled by access. Who could see whom? Who could speak? Who could approach? Fear didn't need to threaten death, it only needed to threaten removal. As the story continues, the idea of fear evolves into something more disturbing. We realize that the code doesn't just silence people, it replaces them. Faces change, names change, roles move from one body to another. Lolan, Shisui, these are not just plot twists, they are demonstrations. Identity in this world is not internal, it is performed. Makeup matters, clothing matters, where you stand matters. And once those elements align, the system treats the role as real, regardless of the person underneath. This is why fake deaths are so effective. Not because the court is easily fooled, but because it is willing to be fooled. Convenient death simplifies things. It closes questions, and it restores order. And once order is restored, proof becomes inconvenient. This is why the court doesn't fear liars. It fears people who can change appearances, because those people understand the language power actually speaks. The court fears ghosts because ghosts destabilize space, but it fears masks more because masks destabilize identity. If identity can be reassigned, then loyalty becomes meaningless, punishment becomes symbolic, justice becomes optional. The system survives not by knowing who people are, but by controlling who they are allowed to be. This brings us to the Moon Fairy. This scene is easy to read as spectacle, foreign envoys, moonlight, a beautiful illusion. But the most important detail happens quietly. Maomao names the figure. She calls her Diana. That choice matters. Not because Diana is Roman, not because she's Western, not because of her mythology, but because she is recognizable. The court doesn't invent a new legend. It borrows one that already exists. And the moment the illusion is named, belief clicks into place. No one debates whether the Moon Fairy was real because the name completes the story. This is how soft power works, not by creating belief from nothing, but by selecting the belief that already fits. The envoys didn't need proof, they needed confirmation that the story they carried with them could be made visible. And once that happens, the illusion stops being fragile, it becomes diplomatic reality. After poisonings, after conspiracies, after near disasters, the palace continues. This is one of the bravest choices the story makes. Most narratives would treat these moments as turning points. The Apothecary Diaries treats them as interruptions. And historically, this is exactly how imperial systems worked. Crises were not opportunities for reform. They were inconveniences to be smoothed over. Person removed, a role reassigned, a rule clarified, and then life went on. The goal was never justice. The goal was continuity. This is why the ending feels calm and hollow. Because nothing is resolved, only stabilized. Luomen's return is often misread as forgiveness. It isn't. No one clears his name. No one apologizes. He's brought back because someone needs to survive childbirth. That's it. This reflects a brutal historical truth. Medicine existed outside morality. Competence mattered more than purity. Results mattered more than reputation. The system didn't care if you were disgraced as long as you were useful, and usefulness always came with conditions. This is where me and I'm sure many viewers expect the story to pivot. Confession, a choice, a promise. But the romance in the Apothecary Diaries refuses to take over the narrative, and that restraint is intentional. In court systems, romance is dangerous. It creates leverage. It creates vulnerability. It creates reasons to be targeted. So affection is expressed indirectly, through medicine, through distance, through outspoken concern. Maomao doesn't misunderstand love. She understands its cost, and she chooses survival. Love exists, but it is not allowed to rewrite the world. At its core, the Apothecary Diaries keeps returning to one truth. Hierarchy decides worth. Rank determines whose death matters, whose pain is investigated, whose survival is optional, and everyone knows this. Maomao sees everything, but knowledge does not equal authority. Historically, knowledge without power was dangerous. That's why Maomao survives by not demanding change. She adapts, not because she agrees, but because adaptation is the only available form of agency. The halls are quiet again, meals are served, people walk their routes, life continues. And the story ends not with justice, but with stability. The Apothecary Diaries isn't asking whether the system is cruel, it's asking why. Even when everyone knows it is, most people still choose to survive inside it. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't abuse of power, it's how easily the world goes on afterward. Maomao does not smile much. She rarely raises her voice. She almost never reacts the way others expect. Because of that, many people think she's cold. Even inside the story, characters misunderstand her. They think she does not care. But season 2 slowly shows us the truth. Maomao is not cold. She's careful. And in a place like the Rear Palace, being careful is the only way to survive. So today, I want to talk about Maomao, not as a genius, not as an apothecary, but as a person, and why her distance is not cruelty, it is protection. The Rear Palace is not loud. It is quiet, polite, smiling, but that silence is heavy. People are watched, judged, compared. A wrong word can ruin a life. A wrong reaction can attract attention, and attention is dangerous. Maomao learned this early. Long before the palace, she learned that showing too much invites trouble. So she adapted, not by hardening her heart, but by hiding it. To understand Maomao, we have to start with her past, because distance is something she learned. Maomao did not grow up in safety. She grew up in the pleasure district, a place where affection is bought, where kindness is temporary, where people leave. In a place like that, getting attached hurts. So you learn not to. Maomao learned to observe, not cling, to understand people, not rely on them. Season 2 shows this clearly. When others panic, Maomao watches. When others react emotionally, she pauses. This does not mean she feels less. It means she learned that feelings are safer when kept inside, and that habit never left her. But being careful does not mean being uncaring. In fact, Maomao cares deeply. She just shows it differently. In season 2, Maomao helps constantly. She notices illness, she prevents deaths, she solves problems, but she never announces it. She does not demand praise, she does not explain herself. Often, she lets others take credit, not because she does not value herself, but because visibility is dangerous. There are moments where we see her care clearly. She worries quietly, she hesitates before leaving someone behind, she feels guilt when she arrives too late. One small moment says everything. When Shaolong leaves the palace, Maomao does not say much, but later she sheds a tear. Just one hidden tear. That tear tells us the truth. Maomao feels deeply, she just refuses to perform it for others. Still, there is one person who keeps testing her distance. Jinshi. Jinshi is different. He sees Maomao's intelligence, he sees her value, and slowly he wants to get closer. Maomao resists, not because she dislikes him, but because closeness is dangerous. Season 2 raises the tension between them. Jinshi steps into power, he becomes more visible, and Maomao pulls back. She avoids emotional honesty. She avoids dependence. Because she understands something Jinshi is only learning. Power changes relationships, and once someone has power over you, you cannot be careless around them. Maomao keeps her distance to stay equal, to stay safe, so her restraint is not rejection, it is rather survival. Before we end, there is one more thing that helps us understand Maomao, and it's not about her personality, it's about the world she lives in. In cult culture like this, especially in ancient China, women were watched constantly, not just by gods, but by rules. How you spoke mattered, how you reacted mattered. Even your face could be judged. Silence was not weakness, silence was safety. Women who spoke too much were remembered, and being remembered was dangerous, as we said. Servants survived by being invisible, concubines survived by being agreeable, and people like Maomao, who knew things, survived by pretending they didn't. This is why Maomao never rushes, why she avoids praise, why she hides her skill. In this world, knowledge without status is not power, it is suspicion. So Maomao does not try to change the system, she learns how to move inside it, quietly and carefully. And when you see the world like this, Maomao's distance stops feeling strange. It starts feeling necessary. Maomao is not cold, she's observant, she's restrained, she's careful. In a world where women are punished for being noticed, she learned how to disappear without vanishing. She protects herself by staying quiet, by staying useful but not threatening, by caring but not openly. And maybe that is why she endures. Not because she's the smartest person in the room, but because she understands when not to speak. Sometimes distance is not the absence of feeling, it is the shape that care takes when the world is unsafe. Jinshi is always calm, always beautiful, always distant. For a long time, he feels like a decoration, someone important but not dangerous. But season 2 slowly shows something else. Jinshi had power the whole time, he just didn't use it. And when he finally does, someone has already been hurt. Today, I want to talk about Jinshi, not as a love interest, but as someone who waited too long to act, because sometimes not acting is still a choice. Before we start, we need to understand where Jinshi stands. Jinshi lives in the inner court, a place full of rules, a place full of silence. He looks like a eunuch. He acts harmless, he keeps himself small, but he isn't powerless. He has access, he has authority, he has the Emperor's trust, and most importantly, he understands the system. Still, he chooses restraint. He believes that using power is dangerous, that acting openly causes harm, that staying quiet is safer. At least that's what he tells himself. This belief shapes everything he does, and that leads us to the first point. Jinshi waits. He watches problems grow, he lets others handle things, he stays in the background. To him, this feels moral. If he doesn't interfere, he doesn't abuse power. If he stays quiet, he doesn't become like the people before him. But season 2 shows something important. Waiting does not stop harm. It only delays responsibility. We see this clearly across the rear palace. Danger builds slowly. Rumors spread. People get hurt quietly. And Jinshi knows. He notices patterns. He understands threats. But he keeps choosing distance. Not because he can't act, but because he's afraid of what acting means. And that choice has consequences. Eventually, the consequences stop being abstract. They become personal. Everything changes when Maomao is taken. This moment is crucial. Maomao isn't just a servant. She's someone Jinshi trusts, someone he relies on, someone he protects quietly. When she is abducted, his restraint breaks. For the first time, waiting is no longer acceptable. Jinshi finally uses his position. He gives orders, he pushes authority, he stops hiding behind politeness, and the shift is immediate. Things move faster, people listen, doors open, the truth becomes clear. He could have done this before. That realization hurts, because Maomao's suffering did not come from lack of power, it came from delay. This is where Jinshi's regret turns real. This hesitation isn't random. It reflects how power worked in historical imperial courts. In systems like ancient China, power was dangerous to show openly, especially in the inner court. Acting too directly could mean suspicion, political enemies, exile, execution. People survived by appearing harmless. Eunuchs, servants, and inner officials were expected to manage quietly, not command loudly. Visibility invited danger, so restraint became a survival skill. Jinshi didn't just fear making mistakes, he feared becoming visible. He feared stepping into the role that history destroys first. That's why waiting felt safe. That's why silence felt moral. But history also shows something else. When power hides too long, it protects systems, not people. And Jinchi learns that lesson the hard way. After this moment, there is no returning to silence. After this point, Jinchi is different. He no longer plays the harmless role. He stops pretending to be decoration. He stops hiding behind beauty and charm. He acts as himself, not loudly, not violently, but clearly. He accepts that power is part of him, and avoiding it only causes damage. This is also where his identity starts to crack. The mask of Jinchi can't hold anymore. He cannot stay in the shadows forever. Season 2 makes this clear. Power unused still shapes outcomes. Silence still creates victims. And Jinchi finally understands that. But understanding doesn't erase damage. Jinchi is not a villain. He didn't act out of cruelty. He didn't ignore others on purpose. He waited because he was afraid of becoming like the past, afraid of using power wrongly. But the story is honest. Good intentions do not cancel consequences. Maomao survives, the situation resolves, but scars remain. Jinchi learns something painful. Using power too late is still a failure. Shisui saves people. That sounds like a good thing, sounds heroic, but in the Apothecary Diaries Season 2, saving others comes with a cost, and Shisui pays more than anyone else. She doesn't get praise, she doesn't get closure, she doesn't even get to stay. Today, I want to talk about Shisui, not as a villain, not as a winner, but as the character who paid the highest price. At first, Shisui feels light. She smiles, she jokes, she blends in, but slowly, Season 2 shows us the truth. Shisui carries secrets. She makes choices quietly, and every choice costs her something. She doesn't act for glory, she acts to protect others, and the story never lets her forget that. That brings us to the first point. Shisui saves people, but every time she does, she loses something in return. She loses her family, she loses her identity, she loses her home. By the end, she's no longer Shisui. She becomes someone else, someone erased. And this is important. Shisui doesn't sacrifice one thing. She sacrifices everything at once. Her past is gone. Her name is gone. Her place in the world is gone. The story does not soften this. There is no reward scene, no moment where it feels worth it, only absent. And even survival does not bring peace. Shisui survives, she escapes execution, she escapes punishment. On paper, this looks like a victory, but it doesn't feel like one. She leaves without answers, without goodbyes, without closure. Her freedom is quiet, and it is heavy. She carries grief with her, not relief. The story makes this very clear. Survival is not the same as happiness. Freedom is not the same as healing. Shisui lives, but she leaves parts of herself behind. This kind of ending is deeply tied to history. In ancient imperial systems, especially in East Asia, survival often meant disappearance. People who knew too much were not celebrated. They were removed, sometimes quietly, sometimes politely, sometimes under the excuse of mercy. Exile was common, erasure was common. You lived, but you no longer existed. For women especially, identity was fragile. Your name, your rank, your family, all of it could vanish overnight. Shisui's ending reflects this reality. She isn't punished publicly, she isn't redeemed publicly. She is simply removed from the story. That is not a failure of writing, it is a reflection of how power protected itself. But the cost of her choices doesn't stop with her. Shisui disappears, and the people she leaves behind are left in the dark. Shaolan never gets answers. She doesn't know what happened. She doesn't know why. She doesn't even know if Shisui is alive. This matters because grief without answers never resolves. Shalan doesn't get closure. She doesn't get a goodbye. The story doesn't fix this, and that silence feels intentional. Not everyone gets to understand the truth. Most people simply live with the gap. This silence is also historical. In rigid hierarchies, lower ranking people were rarely told the truth. Information flowed upward, not downward. Servants were expected to accept outcomes, not explanation. Deaths were vague, disappearances were normalized. Asking questions was dangerous. Shalan's ignorance is not an oversight, it reflects how power worked. Those at the bottom lived with uncertainty as a permanent condition, and that makes Shisui's disappearance hurt even more. That silence is part of the price. Much like Jinshi, Shisui is not a villain. She's not a hero. She's someone who chose others over herself, and the world did not reward her for it. She loses her name, her place, her future as she knew it. She survives, but she pays the highest price. Not with death, but with disappearance. Luoman comes back. The man who spent years in a prison adjacent role, separated from his daughter, kept useful but not free, he comes back. And the court doesn't collapse. Nobody riots. Nobody rewrites the rules. The maids go back to their routines. Maomao goes back to her medicines. The pavilion keeps running exactly the way it always did. And that moment, that quiet, unremarkable return to normal, is actually the most honest thing this show does. Because that's what the end of a story looks like inside a closed system. Not a revolution, not a reckoning, just the world exhaling and continuing. Most stories teach you to expect a certain shape. Something bad happens, someone fights back, the wrong gets corrected, and then the world looks different than it did before. The Apothecary Diaries doesn't do that. And by the time the season 2 ends, it's clear that's not an accident. What it does instead is something more specific and more unsettling if you pay attention. It shows you a system that corrects itself, not because justice happened, but because the disruption became inconvenient. Concubine Jin was poisoned, Lady Shin hid a sick servant, people were manipulated, deceived, occasionally killed, and in every single case, the resolution isn't about fairness, it's about restoring function. The problem gets removed, the court keeps moving. That's the pattern, and episode after episode, the finale included, the show lets it happen without pretending it's satisfying. Let's go back to Loman. His situation in this world is specific. He is a doctor, an exceptional one. He helped deliver the current emperor. He knows things about the imperial bloodline that make him valuable and dangerous at the same time. So the system didn't get rid of him. It kept him contained but alive, useful but not free. That's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. That's administration. And when he finally comes back, when that situation resolves, it's not because someone stood up and demanded justice, it's because the conditions around him shifted. The people holding those pieces moved. The political geometry changed just enough. He returns. Maomao gets something she was missing, and the world moves on. What's interesting is how the show frames this. It doesn't ask you to celebrate it too loudly. The reunion is real and it matters, but the circumstances that created the separation in the first place, those don't get examined. Nobody is punished for them. Nobody publicly admits what happened. The system that ground him down just quietly stopped. That's not closure, that's correction. Here is the thing about closed systems that the show understands deeply. They don't reform, they adjust. When Lady Shin is exiled, the pavilion keeps running. When the Western envoys leave, the court returns to its rhythms. When the poisoning cases get solved, the same hierarchy that allowed those conditions to exist is still fully intact. Nobody dismantles it. Nobody even suggests that the structure itself was the problem. Maomao solves the case. The case gets solved, the world stays the same. And you could read that as cynicism, but I don't think that's quite right, because the show isn't saying nothing matters. It's saying something more specific. It's saying that what matters is survival, and survival inside a closed system doesn't look like change. It looks like endurance, knowing which rooms to avoid, which questions not to ask out loud, which people to keep close without letting them too close. The world doesn't change in the Apothecary Diaries. It clears its throat, adjusts its posture, and the people who are still standing are the ones who understood that from the beginning. Maomao is the clearest expression of how this works. She's not trying to change the system. At no point does she look around the rear palace and think, this structure is wrong, I need to fix it. She thinks, this problem is in front of me, I can solve it, I will solve it, and then I will go back to my medicines. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. And in another story, that would feel like defeat, like someone too broken or too small to imagine anything better. But the show frames it differently. Her detachment isn't failure, it's precision. She has looked at this world clearly, without romanticizing it or despairing over it, and she has found the exact angle from which she can be useful without being consumed. She doesn't need the world to change to survive it. She just needs to understand it more clearly than it understands her. That's a very specific kind of power, and it's the only kind that actually works here. By the end of the season 2, there is a particular feeling the show leaves you with. Not triumph, not grief, something quieter than both. The cases are solved, the bad actors are removed or neutralized, the relationships are a little warmer than they were before, Lumen is back, Pavilion continues, and Maomao is still here, still observant, still careful, still exactly as capable as she has always been. Nothing changed, and somehow that feels okay. I think the reason is this: the show never pretended change was available. It didn't set up a revolution and fail to deliver it. It showed you a world honestly, where power corrects for disruption and not for justice, where survival is a skill rather than a reward, where quiet endurance is a real form of strength, and then it lets its characters live inside that world with dignity. That's why the ending feels calm, not because everything is fine, but because the people who mattered made it through. They are still here. The world exhaled, and tomorrow looks like today. That's not a tragedy. In a place like this, that's a win. So is the Apothecary Diaries a hopeful show? I think it's something more precise than that. It's an honest show, one that looks at how power actually moves, not how we want it to, and finds something worth caring about inside that reality anyway. The world doesn't change, it clears its throat, but the people who survive it, they are worth watching. Fear is powerful, not because it is true, but because people believe it. In the Apothecary Diaries, fear is rarely loud. It whispers, it repeats itself, and slowly it controls behavior. Season 2 shows this clearly, through ghost stories, through masks, through mirrors, through rumors no one wants to question. Today I want to talk about one idea: how fear is made, who it protects, and why it keeps working. To understand this, we first need to accept something uncomfortable. Fear does not need facts, it only needs belief. In season 2, we see several moments where people act not because something is proven, but because everyone agrees it might be real. Take the ghost rumors in the rear palace. No one ever confirms the ghost exists. No proof is shown. No spirit is called. Yet people avoid places. People whisper. People change routines. Fear already did its job. In the episode with the ghost haunting Lady Lishu, the fear is specific. Same time, same place, same appearance. That repetition makes it feel real, even when nothing supernatural is happening. The pattern convinces people. Fear becomes stronger than evidence. And once belief takes hold, it can be shaped. Fear is rarely created from nothing. It is built carefully. Season 2 shows this through illusion. Mirrors, makeup, costumes, stories told at the right moment. Nothing magical, nothing supernatural, just planning. The ghost is revealed to be a mirror angle, a specific clothing, a controlled setting. The person behind it understands something important. If fear looks ancient, people won't question it. If fear feels ritualistic, people obey it. The illusion is not meant to last forever, only long enough to force compliance. This is very accurate to history. In many imperial courts, ghost stories were not entertainment, they were tools. Stories of curses, spirits, or bad omens were often used to control women, servants, or control rivals quietly. If someone could be be labeled unlucky or cursed, they didn't need to be accused. Fear isolated them. The system stayed clean. Hands stayed clean. But illusion alone isn't enough, so we need to ask the hardest question. Fear never spreads evenly. It always protects someone. In season 2, fear protects those already in power. The ones who know the truth stay silent. The ones who don't are left guessing. For example, in season 2, Lady Lishu is young, inexperienced, isolated. When she is scared, she's not protected. She's doubted. Her fear becomes proof that she doesn't belong. Meanwhile, the person creating the fear keeps their position. Fear doesn't punish wrongdoing, it punishes vulnerability. Think back to Lishu's former lady in waiting and how she treated her even when Jinshi and Maomao was there. See, like that's the prime example. And this is where fear becomes more than emotion. It becomes structure. Historically, imperial systems valued stability over justice. Fear was useful because it discouraged resistance, it prevented questions, it enforced hierarchy without force. If people are scared, they self-police, they avoid trouble, they avoid attention, they accept silence. Fear replaces violence, and that makes it efficient. Season 2 never celebrates the truth being revealed. The ghost illusion ends quietly. No apology, no punishment that feels fair. The system doesn't care. That fear was manufactured. It only cares that order returns. Ghost stories in the Apothecary Diaries are never really about ghosts. They are about people, about how easily fear spreads, about how belief replaces truth, about how power stays invisible. Season 2 shows us something unsettling. Fear doesn't need lies. It only needs silence. And as long as fear works, those in power rarely change it. And after all this fear, after the masks fall and the truth comes out, something strange happens. The world doesn't change. People go back to work, roles settle back into place, daily life quietly resumes. Jinshi had something to say, something important. You could feel it building across multiple episodes. He gets close, the moment is there, and Maomao locks the door. Not dramatically, not cruelly, he just redirects. Switches the subject. Steps back behind the glass she keeps between herself and anything that would require her to feel something in real time. And Jinshi stands on the other side of that door, having not said what he needed to say. In most anime, that scene would be the crisis, the moment the romance finally breaks open. Instead, in the Apothecary Diaries, it's just Tuesday. The investigation continues, the court keeps moving, and the two of them stay exactly where they have always been, close enough to matter, far enough to function. That restraint is not an accident, it's the whole point. There is a version of this story where Maomao and Jinshi are the center of everything, where the political intrigue is the backdrop and the love story is the foreground, where every episode inches them closer to a confession, where the tension between them becomes the main engine that keeps you watching. The Apothecary Diaries is not that version. And what's interesting is that the romantic tension is genuinely there. Jinshi is clearly not subtle about his interest. Maomao is clearly not as immune to it as she pretends to be. The show doesn't hide this or ask you to ignore it. It's present in almost every scene they share, but it never takes over, and the reason it doesn't is actually worth examining, because it's a structural choice that shapes everything else about how the story works. The easy reading of Maomao's resistance is that she's cold, emotionally unavailable, doesn't understand what Jinshi is offering, but she tells you directly why that's not quite right. She grew up in a courtesan parlor. From childhood, she watched adults perform intimacy. She learned to read the structure of it, who benefits, who loses, what's being exchanged, before she ever understood the feeling underneath it. Emotion was performance long before it was honesty, and by the time it stopped being performance around her, the reflex was already built. She doesn't miss his signals because she can't read them, she misses them because she processes them too late. By the time she understands what just happened in the conversation, she's already 3 steps past the moment where she could have responded to it. That's not coldness, that's a specific kind of delayed emotional processing that the show traces directly back to where she grew up. And that matters, because it means the romance isn't being avoided for dramatic convenience. It's being shaped by a character history. The way these two move around each other is a direct consequence of who they are and where they came from. On Jinshi's side, the restraint looks different. He is a man who has spent his entire life being decorative on purpose. Beautiful, disarming, easy to underestimate, because being underestimated is the only freedom available to someone in his position. His identity is a performance by design. Kazuigetsu hidden inside Jinshi, hiding in plain sight. So when he shows care for Maomao, he can't just say it. Not because he is shy, because clarity invites danger in a world like this. Because naming something makes it visible, and visibility in the rear palace is always a liability. Instead, he gives her rare medicine. He makes sure she has access to the things she needs. He positions himself repeatedly at real political cost between her and the people who would use her or remove her. He shields her without explaining why he's shielding. Protection replaces promises. Action replaces confession. And in a different story, that might feel like avoidance. Here, it feels like the most honest language available to someone who cannot afford to be transparent. The scene where Maomao accidentally touches him and the atmosphere in the room shifts completely is the show at its most direct. Not because of what happens, because of what almost happens. Jinshi clearly wants to say something real. The rare medicine he gives her is a gesture with weight behind it, and he clearly wants that weight acknowledged, or at least accompanied by something more. And Maomao knows this. On some level, she knows exactly what he's offering, and she locks the door, not out of fear, not out of cruelty, out of the same survival instinct that has kept her functional her entire life. Getting too close to something you might lose is a risk she learned early not to take, especially in a place where people get removed, reassigned, poisoned, exiled, especially when the person offering is someone whose position is fundamentally unstable. She doesn't reject him, she postpones indefinitely, and the show allows that to be enough for now. Here is what the restraint actually protects. Every time the romance gets close to taking over, the show redirects your attention to the world around them, to the political machinery, to the people being harmed by systems neither of them can dismantle, to the questions of knowledge and power and survival that the whole series is actually about. The romance doesn't go away, but it never becomes more important than the context it exists inside. And that's actually the most realistic thing about it, because Maomao and Jinshi are not two people who exist separately from this world and happen to have feelings for each other. They are products of it. Everything about how they move, her caution, his performance, the distance they maintain, the gestures they substitute for words, all of it is shaped by the rear palace, by hierarchy, by the specific conditions of survival inside a closed system. If the romance broke open fully, if there were grand confessions and emotional release, it would feel false. Not because the feelings aren't real, but because these are two people who have been trained by their circumstances to be more careful than that. The restraint is the character. Jinshi can't stay in his current position forever. That's confirmed now. The Moon Prince can't hide behind a temporary role indefinitely. Eventually, the code will require him to step into what he actually is. And when that happens, the geometry of everything changes, including the distance he's been able to maintain with Maomao. The show leaves this open deliberately, not as a cliffhanger exactly, more like an honest acknowledgement that the conditions sustaining the current dynamic are temporary. Something will shift, and the question isn't whether these two have feelings for each other, that's long been settled, but whether the world around them will ever create space for those feelings to actually land. That's a romance built on structural tension, not just personal tension, and it's so much more interesting for it. So when people say the romance in the Apothecary Diaries moves too slowly, I understand the feeling, but I think it's the wrong complaint. It moves at the speed that two people shaped by these specific circumstances would actually move. And watching that, watching care find its shape inside constraint, is its own kind of satisfying. The door closed, the moment passed, and they are both still there. That's the whole thing. Behind the wallpaper, there were paintings, not political documents, not strategic plans, just paintings, carefully hidden, done in private, with arsenic laced pigment that slowly worked its way into the body of the man who made them. The late emperor died painting, and nobody knew, because he hid it so completely that it took a corpse that wouldn't decay and a girl who reads rooms like medical cases to find them at all. That's not just a mystery detail, that's a life story compressed into a wall. The late emperor wasn't a bad person. That's the quiet revelation of episodes 8 and 9. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't calculating, he was an artist, genuinely, privately, at a level that meant something to him. An artist, someone whose internal life expressed itself through images, through pigment, through the act of making something that existed only because he chose to put it there. And he was born an emperor. In a world where the emperor is not a person but a function, where the role requires stoicism, authority, the performance of power, not vulnerability, not beauty, not the kind of private joy that comes from painting alone in a room. So he did what people in that position do. He hid it. He pushed the inner life behind the wallpaper and performed what the role required. He became, to everyone around him, exactly what the court needed him to be. And the thing he actually was, the artist, the person, he buried that so thoroughly that it took his death to uncover it. Here's the part that stays with you once you understand it. The pigments he used, orpiment, arsenic based, historically real, they were slowly poisoning him. The tools of his hidden expression were contributing to his death. His art was literally killing him. You could read that as a dark irony, but I think it's something more specific. When you suppress who you actually are so completely, for so long, the thing you're suppressing doesn't disappear. It accumulates, it finds the cracks, and it costs something, slowly, invisibly, until the cost has been paid in full. The arsenic didn't kill him in a single dramatic moment. It was cumulative, fragile, the result of years of a very small thing done in private that nobody was supposed to see. That's not a metaphor the show announces, it's just there, embedded in the facts of the case. And then there is Anchi. The Emperor's psychological unraveling didn't come from the painting alone. It came from her, the Empress Dowager, who understood exactly what kind of man he was, and who used that understanding as a weapon. He could only be drawn to young girls. That was his specific damage, the shape his psychology had warped into, and she knew it. So she visited him at night as an adult woman, and what she did was simple and devastating. She showed him something he couldn't fit into the world he had constructed for himself. She made herself the thing that broke the logic of his avoidance. He stopped leaving his room after that. And here's what's strange about the show's treatment of this. It doesn't ask you to feel entirely one way about it. And she had her reasons. The Emperor had caused harm. What she did was deliberate and targeted, and it worked. But what it also was one person who understood someone's psychological architecture, using that understanding as a precision instrument of punishment. She got her answer. He never recovered. And the court never knew any of it happened. That's not justice. It's not injustice either. It's something in between that the show refuses to resolve for you. The late Emperor's legacy, by the time Maomao uncovers it, is not his reign, it's the paintings. The ones nobody was supposed to see. The ones that explain why his corpse didn't decay, and why his private chambers felt so strange, and why the Empress Dowager needed Maomao to look at the walls. Everything he was publicly, the Emperor, the function, the role, faded. But the thing he'd hid, that persisted. That's what was still there. The show handles this without sentimentality. Maomao doesn't stand in front of the hidden paintings and have a moment of profound reflection. She identifies the pigment, connects it to the preservation of the body, and solves the case. But the image lingers anyway. A room full of hidden art. A man who spent his entire life being something he wasn't and left behind only what he was in private. This is the cleanest version of something the Apothecary Diaries keeps returning to. The system assigns everyone a role, and the role is not the person. In most cases, that's just an inconvenience. You perform what's required. You find their small spaces, you manage. But sometimes the gap between the role and the person is so large that one of them has to go. And in a system like this, it's never the role that goes. Maomao hides her intelligence, Jinshi hides his identity, Xiaolan hides her ambition until she has the tools to act on it quietly. Every person who survives inside this structure has learned to make themselves smaller in some specific way. The late emperor tried to do the same thing. He hid the part of himself that didn't fit, but he hid it with arsenic pigment in a room sealed by wallpaper, and it cost him everything. The question the show keeps asking, and this episode is the starkest version of it, is not whether the system is wrong, it clearly is. The question is what it costs you, specifically to live inside it, and whether the version of yourself that survives is still close enough to who you are to be worth surviving. The late emperor never got to just be a painter. He was always the emperor first, and the painter was always the secret, the thing behind the wall. And here's what I keep coming back to. He was good at it. The paintings were real. The talent was real. There was an actual person in there with an actual inner life, and it had nowhere to go. That's the cost of this world rendered as quietly as possible. Not the violence, not a visible reckoning, just a man, hidden paintings, and a corpse that lasted longer than it should have, because the thing that was slowly killing him was the only honest expression he allowed himself. There is a moment in episode 6 where Lady Shin hides a sick servant instead of helping her, and when Maomao and the others catch her, the conversation that follows is the most quietly devastating thing in the entire season, because it wasn't a crime. Hiding a low ranking servant, letting her suffer, deciding her life was an inconvenience rather than a concern, none of it was actionable under the rules of this world. The servant didn't have the rank to matter. The wrong couldn't be corrected because the system didn't recognize it as a wrong in the first place. That's not a plot point, that's the thesis. Most period dramas use hierarchy as set dressing. The elaborate costumes, the formal titles, the complicated rules about who bows to whom, its atmosphere. It tells you when and where the story is set. It creates obstacles for the characters to navigate. And then the story proceeds to care about the characters regardless of their rank, because that's what stories do. The Apothecary Diaries is doing something different. It's using rank as lens, and what it's examining through that lens is a very specific question. Whose life counts? Not in a philosophical sense, practically, mechanically. When something goes wrong, when someone gets hurt, or poisoned, or used, or discarded, what determines whether that registers as a problem worth solving? The answer, every time, is rank. Not the severity of the harm, not the moral weight of what happened, rank. And the show doesn't editorialize this. It doesn't pause to tell you this is wrong. It just keeps showing you the mechanism, case after case, until you feel it as clearly as the characters do. Maomao understands this world better than almost anyone in it. She can read the situation faster than the people who created it. She can trace a cause back to its source, identify who benefits, name the logic underneath the cruelty. Episode after episode, she is the clearest observer in the room, and it changes almost nothing structural. That's the part that's easy to miss if you're watching for plot momentum, because Mao Mao keeps solving problems, and solving problems feels like progress. But the problems she solves are specific and individual. The condition that generates them, the hierarchy, the closed system, the calculation of whose life is worth protecting, that persists completely untouched. She doesn't try to change it, not because she has given up, because she understands, probably better than anyone, that the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. You don't fix a machine by explaining its logic to it. What you do instead is what she does. You understand it precisely enough to survive inside it. You find the narrow spaces where your specific capabilities make you useful. You protect the people you can reach without drawing so much attention that the system decides to remove you. That's not defeat, That's strategy, but it's a very particular kind of strategy, one that requires accepting, at least functionally, the world as it is. Go back through the season and look at what actually gets people removed. Lady Shin isn't exiled for hiding a sick servant. That was fine. She's exiled because she became a liability, because the political geometry around her shifted to a point where keeping her was more costly than removing her. The exile is a calculation, not a verdict. The poisoning cases get solved not because the court has a genuine interest in justice, but because unexplained deaths are destabilizing. They create uncertainty. Uncertainty in a system built on controlled hierarchy is the actual threat. The death itself matters less than what it implies about who has power to act without consequences. And the late emperor, the artist who hid his paintings behind palace walls, who was exactly wrong for the role he was born into, he isn't remembered with sympathy or tragedy. He's remembered as an administrative problem that resolved itself. In every case, the question is the same. Not, was this wrong? But, is this a disruption we need to manage? That's how power actually moves in this world. And it's recognizable because it's how power often moves in ours. Here is the split the show keeps drawing. The people who understand the system, who can read it clearly, who know what it requires, and can give it what it needs without losing themselves, they survive. They might not thrive, they might operate under significant constraint, but they stay in the game. The people who don't understand it or who refuse to perform what it demands pay the price. Shaolan learning to read and write is not just a warm moment about education, it's about survival strategy. If she gets out of the palace, literacy is leverage. It's the difference between having options and having none. The system gave her that opportunity not out of generosity. Jinshi's motive was political, but she understood immediately what it could mean and she took it. Shisui paid the highest price of anyone in the season. Lost her family, her identity, her place, and what she got in return was survival without closure. Freedom that arrived with grief attached, because the situation she was in required her to give up everything that made her who she was just to get out of it. The system didn't break for her, she had to break around it. And Shaolan never gets answers about what happened. That thread just stays open, because that's how it works for the people on the lower rungs. The story doesn't reach back to resolve things for them, it moves on. The show is set in an ancient imperial court. The costumes are elaborate. The specific political structures are historical. None of this is our world literally, but the logic is. Power punishing inconvenience rather than wrongdoing. That's not ancient. The idea that rank determines whose harm registers as worth correcting, that's not ancient. The way a system can absorb a crisis, remove the specific disruption, and continue entirely unchanged, that's not ancient. What the Apothecary Diaries does, by putting these dynamics inside a beautifully realized historical setting, is give you just enough distance to see the mechanism clearly. The period framing is not escapism, it's a lens. It lets you watch something familiar from a position where you're not inside it, which means you can actually see its shape. And the shape is hierarchy decides worth. Seeing the truth doesn't guarantee change. The system corrects for disruption, not injustice. And survival inside it requires either the right rank or the right kind of invisible usefulness. That's what this show is about. I want to come back to Maomao one more time because she's the argument the show is making about how to live inside this logic. She's not trying to be a hero. She's not positioning herself to change anything. She has one tool, knowledge, specifically medical knowledge, and she uses it precisely and without sentiment. She helps because she can, and because helping in small specific ways is the only honest response she has found to a world that doesn't offer bigger ones. But here is the thing, her detachment, her refusal to need the system to be fair in order to function inside it, that's not resignation, it's a kind of integrity. She sees it clearly and she doesn't pretend otherwise. She doesn't console herself with stories about how the court is secretly just. or how rank secretly doesn't matter, or how the right people are in charge. She looks at the mechanism, understands it, and decides, I'm still going to be here. I'm still going to solve the problem in front of me. That's what I can do. And that decision to remain present and capable inside the world you see clearly without illusion, that's its own form of strength. Not a revolution, not a solution, but something real. So that's what the Apothecary Diaries is actually about. Not just a mystery series set in a pretty historical world, not just a slow burn romance with a capable protagonist. It's a sustained examination of how power works when the structure itself is the problem, and what survival, dignity, and genuine care look like when you can't fix the structure. Maomao doesn't save the world, she saves the person in front of her, again and again, with everything she has. In a place like this, that's not a small thing. So that's all the videos on Apothecary Diaries. If you have watched from the beginning, I genuinely thank you so much. This series gave me a lot to think about, and I hope at least some of it gave you something too. And as always, tell me what you think. Did the show give you what you came for, or did it leave you wanting something it was never going to offer? Drop it in the comments, and I'll see you in season 3. There is a moment in episode 6 where Lady Shin hides a sick servant instead of helping her, and when Maomao and the others catch her, the conversation that follows is the most quietly devastating thing in the entire season, because it wasn't a crime. Hiding a low ranking servant, letting her suffer, deciding her life was an inconvenience rather than a concern, none of it was actionable under the rules of this world. The servant didn't have the rank to matter. The wrong couldn't be corrected because the system didn't recognize it as a wrong in the first place. That's not a plot point, that's the thesis. Most period dramas use hierarchy as set dressing. The elaborate costumes, the formal titles, the complicated rules about who bows to whom, its atmosphere. It tells you when and where the story is set. It creates obstacles for the characters to navigate. And then the story proceeds to care about the characters regardless of their rank, because that's what stories do. The Apothecary Diaries is doing something different. It's using rank as lens, and what it's examining through that lens is a very specific question. Whose life counts? Not in a philosophical sense, practically, mechanically. When something goes wrong, when someone gets hurt, or poisoned, or used, or discarded, what determines whether that registers as a problem worth solving? The answer, every time, is rank. Not the severity of the harm, not the moral weight of what happened, rank. And the show doesn't editorialize this. It doesn't pause to tell you this is wrong. It just keeps showing you the mechanism, case after case, until you feel it as clearly as the characters do. Maomao understands this world better than almost anyone in it. She can read the situation faster than the people who created it. She can trace a cause back to its source, identify who benefits, name the logic underneath the cruelty. Episode after episode, she is the clearest observer in the room, and it changes almost nothing structural. That's the part that's easy to miss if you're watching for plot momentum, because Mao Mao keeps solving problems, and solving problems feels like progress. But the problems she solves are specific and individual. The condition that generates them, the hierarchy, the closed system, the calculation of whose life is worth protecting, that persists completely untouched. She doesn't try to change it, not because she has given up, because she understands, probably better than anyone, that the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. You don't fix a machine by explaining its logic to it. What you do instead is what she does. You understand it precisely enough to survive inside it. You find the narrow spaces where your specific capabilities make you useful. You protect the people you can reach without drawing so much attention that the system decides to remove you. That's not defeat, that's strategy. But it's a very particular kind of strategy, one that requires accepting, at least functionally, the world as it is. Go back through the season and look at what actually gets people removed. Lady Shin isn't exiled for hiding a sick servant. That was fine. She's exiled because she became a liability, because the political geometry around her shifted to a point where keeping her was more costly than removing her. The exile is a calculation investigation, not a verdict. The poisoning cases get solved not because the court has a genuine interest in justice, but because unexplained deaths are destabilizing. They create uncertainty. Uncertainty in a system built on controlled hierarchy is the actual threat. The death itself matters less than what it implies about who has power to act without consequences. And the late emperor, the artist who hid his paintings behind palace walls, who was exactly wrong for the role he was born into, he isn't remembered with sympathy or tragedy. He's remembered as an administrative problem that resolved itself. In every case, the question is the same. Not was this wrong, but is this a disruption we need to manage? That's how power actually moves in this world. And it's recognizable because it's how power often moves in ours. Here is the split the show keeps drawing. The people who understand the system, who can read it clearly, who know what it requires, and can give it what it needs without losing themselves, they survive. They might not thrive, they might operate under significant constraint, but they stay in the game. The people who don't understand it or who refuse to perform what it demands pay the price. Shaolan, learning to read and write, is not just a warm moment about education, it's about survival strategy. If she gets out of the palace, literacy is leverage. It's the difference between having options and having none. The system gave her that opportunity not out of generosity. Jinshi's motive was political, but she understood immediately what it could mean and she took it. Shisui paid the highest price of anyone in the season. Lost her family, her identity, her place, and what she got in return was survival without closure. Freedom that arrived with grief attached, because the situation she was in required her to give up everything that made her who she was just to get out of it. The system didn't break for her, she had to break around it. And Shaolan never gets answers about what happened. That thread just stays open, because that's how it works for the people on the lower rungs. The story doesn't reach back to resolve things for them, it moves on. The show is set in an ancient imperial court. The costumes are elaborate. The specific political structures are historical. None of this is our world literally, but the logic is. Power punishing inconvenience rather than wrongdoing. That's not ancient. The idea that rank determines whose harm registers as worth correcting, that's not ancient. The way a system can absorb a crisis, remove the specific disruption, and continue entirely unchanged, that's not ancient. What the Apothecary Diaries does, by putting these dynamics inside a beautifully realized historical setting, is give you just enough distance to see the mechanism clearly. The period framing is not escapism, it's a lens. It lets you watch something familiar from a position where you're not inside it, which means you can actually see its shape. And the shape is hierarchy decides worth. Seeing the truth doesn't guarantee change. The system corrects for disruption, not injustice. And survival inside it requires either the right rank or the right kind of invisible usefulness. That's what this show is about. I want to come back to Maomao one more time because she's the argument the show is making about how to live inside this logic. She's not trying to be a hero. She's not positioning herself to change anything. She has one tool, knowledge, specifically medical knowledge, and she uses it precisely and without sentiment. She helps because she can, and because helping in small specific ways is the only honest response she has found to a world that doesn't offer bigger ones. But here is the thing, her detachment, her refusal to need the system to be fair in order to function inside it, that's not resignation, it's a kind of integrity. She sees it clearly and she doesn't pretend otherwise. She doesn't console herself with stories about how the court is secretly just, or how rank secretly doesn't matter, or how the right people are in charge. She looks at the mechanism, understands it, and decides, I'm still going to be here. I'm still going to solve the problem in front of me. That's what I can do. And that decision to remain present and capable inside the world you see clearly without illusion, that's its own form of strength. Not a revolution, not a solution, but something real. So that's what the Apothecary Diaries is actually about. Not just a mystery series set in a pretty historical world, not just a slow burn romance with a capable protagonist. It's a sustained examination of how power works when the structure itself is the problem, and what survival, dignity, and genuine care look like when you can't fix the structure. Maomao doesn't save the world, she saves the person in front of her, again and again, with everything she has. In a place like this, that's not a small thing. Maomao tastes poison and she smiles. It's one of the most beloved scenes in the whole show. Nobody stops to ask why a girl who keeps her scars bandaged looks at being poisoned like it's a gift. So in this video, I want to get into why her favorite hobby is also her biggest danger, starting with why pain that's signed off as research is exactly what Maomao does, why she says the quiet part out loud once completely calmly, and why by the end of season 2 the show catches us believing that exact same lie she does. Maomao is the palace's poison taster. She loves the job in a way that isn't quite healthy. In episode 6, at the garden party, she tastes poison in the soup and, for a few seconds, completely loses control in a full body wave of pleasure. For years before that, she has been testing poisons and snake venom on her own body. Her left arm takes the worst of it, which is why it's permanently bandaged. The result is near total immunity to most poisons in this world, a condition called mithridatism. On paper, that reads like a superpower, like she has been training a muscle, except the muscle is her own tolerance for dying. Here is the question one episode leaves us with. Is this really just professional pride, or is this pain that's signed off as research, and nobody around her, including us, ever stops to call it anything else? For example, like some people, self-harm. One scene at a party makes us wonder, but is that really the exception? Or is that just the one time this pain slips out into the open, instead of staying signed off as research the way it does every other day? There's an actual term for this. It's a way people cope with painful things, burying the feeling under logic and analysis until the feeling barely shows up at all. Psychologists call it intellectualization. For Maomao, that looks like this. Poison becomes an experiment. A scar just becomes evidence she can point to instead of explaining how she feels. And that logic never shows up clearer than in episode 9. Maomao's investigating 2 deaths written off as self-inflicted that don't add up. A soldier whose death gets blamed on drinking too much, and a servant girl found drowned in the palace moat. Ruled a suicide despite the evidence. Afterward, she turns to Jinshi, the court official who first noticed her talent and has looked out for her ever since, and says the quiet part out loud. She calmly asks him if he would let her die by poison, if it ever came to that. He's completely thrown. It sounds like cold planning, thinking ahead. Listening to it again though, she's naming her own price. She thinks she's exactly as replaceable as that drowned servant girl. Someone whose death barely got looked into because nobody with power cared enough to ask questions. She's putting a price on her own life and calling it logic. Both times it's wrapped in the same calm logic, but what happens the one time that logic falls apart on its own without her permission? Season 2 finale, Maomao's back at the Verdigris house, the brothel where she grew up. She's working again as its apothecary, mixing medicine when out of nowhere she ties a cord around her pinky finger. She's getting ready to cut it off. For research, she says, obviously. The anime shoots it exactly like that sounds. Calm, matter of fact, just another experiment in a long line of them. Jinshi shows up just in time to stop her, and this is where it actually clicks. The anime never tells you why now specifically, but the light novel does. It shows what she's actually thinking in that moment, that she has just come back from the front lines, that she believes Jinshi doesn't need her anymore, that as a low-born girl, she has no place beside him. The anime dresses this scene up as one more cute science moment, right as she's actually falling apart underneath it. And by letting us read it as research instead of pain, the show catches us believing the exact same lie she does. That's what makes this trait dangerous for her, and for us watching too. I'm sure most of us laughed exactly the way the show trained us to laugh. So next time you see Maomao smiling over a plate of poison, maybe watch that scene again. And hey, one more thing before you go. Do you think she actually knows what she's doing, or does she believe it as much as we do? And did this video change how you see her? Let me know. Maomao doesn't believe in anything she can't test, measure or dissect. Shisui talks to ghosts for a living. On paper, these two couldn't be more different. But there is a moment in each show where the mask slips, and it's the exact same mask. Maomao gets caught having a feeling she can't explain away with science. Shisui gets offered real closeness and, for once, doesn't hide behind the rules of her own religion to avoid it. Which means the thing everyone assumes makes them opposites, rational versus spiritual, was never actually the point. So in this video, I want to get into why Maomao and Shisui can never get close, starting with the one scene each show uses to prove they are not as unreachable as they seem, why their expertise itself is the wall keeping people out, and why neither show actually lets us know if that wall ever comes down for good. Let's start with Maomao. She has spent this entire show reducing people to biology, poison cases, medical mysteries, palace intrigue. All of it gets filtered through the same lens. A person isn't a person, they are a set of symptoms. Then there is the frog scene. Jinshi is changing. Maomao ends up seeing more than she meant to, and for 1 second she reacts like a person would. She blushes, she notices, and then she talks herself back into safety, turns the whole thing into a joke about frogs, and files it away as nothing. That's the tell. If she really felt nothing, there would be nothing to deflect. Now Shisui. Her whole role is built on distance. The Raven consort isn't allowed to be touched, isn't allowed close to anyone, and she has spent the show treating that rule like it's simply how things are. Then Emperor Gaoshun shows up in episode 7, just talking to her like one grieving person to another. And she doesn't retreat behind the sacred rule like she normally would. She accepts what he is offering. Two women, two completely different belief systems, and both of them just got caught doing the exact thing their whole identity says they don't do. Which raises the real question. If the labels don't even hold up once, what are they actually protecting themselves from? Both masks slipped once. But is that a one-time crack or the same thing running underneath every time either of them almost gets close to someone? There is an actual term for what Maomao is doing. It's called intellectualization. Taking something that should hurt or scare you and turning it into a fact instead, so you never have to actually feel it. Watch how consistently she does this. Anytime Jinshi gets close, Maomao's first move is always the same. She reclassifies him as a case study instead of a person. That's evidence 1, and it's the mildest. She's avoiding. Evidence 2. It escalates. When Jinshi tries to actually say something real to her, tries to close the distance in words, Maomao doesn't just deflect once. She keeps cutting him off, redirecting the conversation back to something clinical or something she can control simply. And evidence 3, the sharpest. She does this even when leaving him would clearly cost her something. When her position at the rear palace changes and she has a reason to go. Part of her is affected by it. She frames it entirely in terms of duty and practicality. Here is what's actually going on underneath that. Turning a feeling into a fact is how she survives having it at all. Now Shisui. Her version of the same trick just wears different clothes. It's called spiritual bypassing. Using a sacred role as the reason you can't get close to someone, so it's never framed as your own choice. The Raven consort can't be touched. Shisui treats that as an ironclad fact of the universe. Evidence 1. She cites the rule automatically, almost reflexively, anytime someone tries to close the distance. Evidence 2. When Gaoshun keeps coming back anyway, offering food, offering conversation, offering just plain company, Her first instinct is still to warn him off, tell him that closeness with the raven brings misfortune. The rule becomes the reason, so she never has to say the real one. And evidence 3, the sharpest. By the finale, what's actually changed isn't the rule, it's her. She has slowly learned to let people stay near her without immediately invoking it, which means the sacred isolation was never really about the law being unbreakable, it was about her not being ready to risk what happens when someone gets close and it goes wrong again. So you have the same shape but a different language. Maomao turns feeling into fact, and Shisui turns fear into law. Either way, neither one has to say out loud, I am scared of losing someone. They are both hiding and hiding well, but hiding costs something. So what happens to the people who actually try to get close anyway? And this is where it actually clicks. The exact thing making them useful to everyone around them is also the thing keeping everyone out. Jinshi doesn't just find Maomao interesting because she's clever, he keeps trying to get her to acknowledge him as something other than a curiosity to study, and every time, her competence is right there waiting to save her from having to answer. She can always retreat into being the apothecary. Being needed for her skill means she never has to be needed for herself, never has to actually let him get close. Gao Shun does something similar with Shisui. He shows up with food, with conversation, with basically the same gesture over and over, I'm just here as a person. And Shushei's sacred role is right there waiting to save her from having to answer that too. The law says she can't get close, so she doesn't have to choose not to. That's the actual cost underneath both of these shows. The thing that makes Maomao and Shisui exceptional is also functioning as the wall, keeping the people who care about them on the other side of it. And neither show resolves that fully. Episode 7 has Shisui accept one gesture of closeness, but the isolation of her role doesn't lift. Maomao's frog scene blush doesn't turn into her admitting anything to Jinshi directly. Both women get one visible crack and then the wall stays standing. So here's the part I genuinely don't know the answer to. If you took away Maomao's poisons and Shushei's ghosts completely, if neither of them had the skill left to hide behind, would they actually let someone get close? Or would they just find something else to be indispensable at instead? You can let me know your thoughts in the comments, but that's the wall underneath both of these shows. Maomao turns feeling into fact, Shisui turns fear into law, different tools, same job, stay close enough to be needed, and far enough to never actually risk getting close yourself. If you have seen one of those shows or both, let me know what are your thoughts about this, if I missed something, or if you have something more that we could take all away. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.